question concerns a red tag received for a 200 amps main breaker panel being too high in an antique car showroom. The main breaker handle is at 6 feet above the finished floor. The electrical code section relevant to this situation is National Electrical Code 404.8a. This section addresses the height requirements for operating devices and specifies that the center of the grip of the operating handle of switches and circuit breakers used to control lighting and appliances shall not be more than 6 feet 7 inches above the floor or working platform. However, there is an exception to this rule. Exception number 1 to National Electrical Code 404.8 states that lighting panel boards supplied by a 120 volts or 240 volts 3-wire single-phase branch circuit that have no more than 42 overcurrent devices may be located a maximum of 6.5 feet from the floor. To clarify the application of National Electrical Code 404.8 and its exception, it is crucial to understand what constitutes a lighting panel board and how the number of overcurrent devices affects the allowable height. Firstly, let's define a lighting panel board. A lighting panel board is typically understood as a panel board that primarily supplies lighting circuits. However, the code definition is not as restrictive, and the exception can apply if the panel meets the voltage and wiring configuration requirements and the overcurrent device limit, even if it supplies other loads in addition to lighting. The exception specifically applies to panel boards supplied by a 120 volts or 240 volts 3-wire single-phase branch circuit. This means the panel must be fed from a single-phase source with a neutral wire, providing both 120 volts and 240 volts. The 3-wire configuration is essential for this exception to apply. The exception also limits the number of overcurrent devices in the panel board to no more than 42. Overcurrent devices include circuit breakers or fuses. It is essential to accurately count the number of overcurrent devices in the panel board to determine if the exception applies. If the panel board meets all three criteria, namely supplied by 120 volts or 240 volts 3-wire single-phase branch circuit, has no more than 42 overcurrent devices, and is considered a lighting panel board, then it can be located a maximum of 6.5 feet from the floor. It is important to measure the height accurately to ensure compliance with the code. The height is measured from the floor to the highest point of the panel board enclosure. In the described scenario, the main breaker handle is at 6 feet above the finished floor. This is below the maximum height of 6 feet 7 inches specified in National Electrical Code 404.8a. However, the question is whether the top of the panel exceeds the maximum height. If the panel board meets the criteria outlined in exception number 1 of National Electrical Code 404.8a, then the maximum allowable height is 6.5 feet. If the top of the panel is higher than 6.5 feet, then it would be a code violation. It is also crucial to verify that the panel board is indeed supplied by a 120 volts or 240 volts 3-wire single-phase branch circuit, and that it has no more than 42 overcurrent devices. If the panel board does not meet these criteria, then the general rule of National Electrical Code 404.8 applies, which limits the height of the operating handle to 6 feet 7 inches. Furthermore, it is essential to consult with the local electrical inspector to clarify any ambiguities and ensure compliance with local amendments to the National Electrical Code. Local jurisdictions may have their own specific requirements that differ from the National Electrical Code. In summary, to determine whether the red tag is valid, several factors must be considered. Firstly, the height of the top of the panel board must be measured accurately. Secondly, the electrical characteristics of the supply circuit must be verified to ensure that it is a 120 volts or 240 volts 3-wire single-phase branch circuit. Thirdly, the number of overcurrent devices in the panel board must be counted to ensure that it does not exceed 42. Finally, local electrical codes and regulations must be consulted to identify any additional requirements. By carefully evaluating these factors, it can be determined whether the panel board installation complies with the applicable electrical codes.